So this is a shroud kit for the T56 Magnum transmission, specifically called the 6-volt Magnum. That's what everybody calls it. And what it is a shroud that is going to keep fluid from being exposed to the bottom side of the shifter. And I'm going to show you what that means. And the shifter is made to mount in the rear or in the front. So the offset lever has two locations inside. And you can put the shifter in the back with the stick here, or you can put it up here, and it gives you a little bit of adjustment as far as where your shifter is going to come through the floor. Great design. What is not a great design is once you get through here, you can see, like, even this shifter, this boot's already torn. And this is a common problem with these. They just don't hold up over time. It's just this boot doesn't hold up very well, and it causes some issues. So one of the main problems is, you can see when you put the shifter in the forward location, you can see your pivot cup location. You see this gear down in here, directly below it.
Yep.
As this thing is at speed, the fluid that's on that gear, it's just getting flung 360 degrees around, right there. Specifically right under the shifter, where your now torn boot is located. And specifically with the Tremec shifter itself, you can see, if I expose this inside area, you can see that boot down in there very well. And from where I'm standing, I can actually see the table on the other side.
Yep, I can see light coming through it.
Yeah. So what happens is it starts slinging that fluid up into this shifter, and then it starts working its way out around this boot and leaking underneath the car. And that's something that actually happens with aftermarket shifters as well, specifically when it's mounted in this forward location. Because of that gear, able to sling fluid up all around the sides of this shift lever, it causes fluid to escape. So, knowing that and having some feedback from customers and working with a couple of other people who have been dealing with this issue for a while, we decided, hey, let's tackle this, see if we can come up with something to solve this problem. So what we've got is our shroud kit that we've come up with. And it's a simple in design of how it works. It's just like a windage tray for a crankshaft, basically. So it's going to block off all the area around that shift rail, or as much as it can within reason, because that thing still has to be able to rotate and move. So you can't get 100% of the seal, but you can get enough to keep that fluid from being so directional that it comes up against the shifter. It's going to hit that and splash off and go another direction. That's the goal with a windage tray, or a shroud in this case. It's a little technical in the install, so we're doing a little bit of an install video in order to show people how to set this up. So the tools that you're going to need for this install are pretty basic. I am going to use two 15mm wrenches. I'm also going to use a 15mm socket that's a swivel on an impact, just to make it easier to get the factory bolts out. And then you're also going to need something with a 5/16 socket. I like to use a 1/4 inch because we're dealing with small diameter fasteners, and I don't want to break those. First thing we're going to do is remove the two 15mm headed bolts that are inside of the shifter opening. Some of the cases you can run this stud in with your fingers, but it's a little bit tight in here to do that. So what I like to do is your typical double nut method on the stud itself. I'll just twist the two together against the flanges. Take your wrenches, tighten those nuts together a little bit. Something to keep in mind is that there's the ability to drop some of this stuff down inside the transmission. So probably a good idea to block off these openings underneath this, only with a rag, a cloth. In my case, I'm just going to use a couple of paper towels just to make sure we don't drop anything down in these openings. And if we do, we'll be able to get it back. I got my stud double nutted. I can stick that in and get it started. I'm going to put my socket back on there, and I'm just going to ease that in. Then we're going to repeat this process with our second stud. And something to note, we want to get this thing pretty close to the end. So we don't want to run this stud all the way through our outside nut in this case, just to make sure we have clearance to be able to get a wrench back on the second nut to actually take it off. So I tighten these together. And again, this doesn't have to be like, you can just snug those together. Don't strip the nuts out trying to tighten them against each other. Because all we're doing is inserting this thread into the threads of the case itself. And the only reason we're doing the double nut is because sometimes these bolts have sealer on them. This one doesn't really have much, but this transmission is actually not brand new. It's been rebuilt. So it doesn't have sealer on the bolts as the factory would have had them. The next two items to go on will be these spacers. So just be careful when you put these on. You're just going to put it over the stud and slide it all the way up to the case. Pretty simple. The next piece we're going to install is going to be what we call the L bracket. It comes pre-assembled with the spacers and the nuts already on it. So we're just going to take those off. That way we're not trying to take them off while it's inside the transmission. Okay, so now we have this. It's just got these studs sticking up, and it's ready to slip on. So just slide this up on the studs. Leave yourself enough room to be able to pull this paper towel out later. Make sure we have enough room for that. Okay. So now that that is on, we can install our nuts. So you're going to pull this back slightly, get your nuts started. And you're going to get this one started as well. Similar. Then we can run these up to the housing. So at this point in time, we can go ahead and tighten these 15mm nuts all the way. It's our wrench. We'll have to use the open end in this case. Put it on the way. So something you may have to do in order to get this tight is kind of rotate this a little bit out of the way so you can get your wrench in there to actually get on the nut itself. Okay, so those are tight. The next step is going to be to install the spacers back onto the L bracket over the studs. And then we're ready to install the upper plate. That simply slides down over the studs. Then you're going to use your nuts. These nuts are serrated. That way they stay attached. We're going to start that down on our threaded stud. And now we're going to use our 5/16 socket to tighten these nuts. Don't get carried away here because they're only number 6 studs. And they would be very easy to break. We're just going to snug these down. And now we can pull our cloths out when we're using catch anything. So that's pretty much it. This thing's now installed. And as you can see, it leaves a window for your pivot shaft to go through, but it blocks off all the open area around the shifter shaft itself. And it gives it 2 layers. So it's got an overhang here, and then it's got an overhang at the bottom. And what that allows is it gives it at least 2 points that it could potentially contact before it would try to come into contact with your shifter. And as I stated before, you can't completely block this off because this thing does need to pivot. And you don't want that to make any contact, causing you to not be able to get the transmission in gear. But it does maximize the space. It does block as much of the opening as it physically can.
Is that it? Cool.